The unsurpassed, perfecting and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I help to make the Buddha's teeth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. So you'll forgive me for the lumps in my cheeks. Those are 2 cough drops. I tried for the high notes in the invocations, and I didn't always make them, but they took their toll on my voice, and so I'm trying to remedy that so I can speak. During the dedication, I heard Reverend Master Mayon ask the Buddha of healing, and I'm not sure I got this completely right, so please forgive me, Reverend Master Mayon, if it's not completely right, but to ask for the healing of the Dharma that helps us find true peace, something like that. It ended with true peace, and that struck me because that's what I'm hoping to talk about today, finding true peace. And the talk is based on the 3rd section of Great Master Eihei Dogen's essay on the 8 qualities of a great person, which is Shobo Genzo Hachi Dainin Gaku. And there's a commentary on that chapter found in this book by Kosho Uchiyama Roshi, a Soto Zen master of the 20th century in Japan. And there's also a translation of it by Reverend Master Hubert Neerman, the late Reverend Master Hubert Neerman, which is available on our website. So you can go look at it there. The section 3's title has been translated both as Appreciating Serenity / Quietude and as Enjoying the Tranquility of Nirvana. And one thing it's helpful to keep in mind, if this sounds familiar, Dogen based this chapter on the scripture of the Buddha's last teachings, which is why some of it may sound familiar. And the Buddha gave that last teachings to monks as he lay dying. So the teaching was given to monks, although like all the Buddha's teaching, there is something for everyone. And I just want to make clear as I go on that neither the Buddha nor Great Master Dogen is advising you to abandon your family's homes and livelihoods and go take up residence in a hut in the forest, okay? That's not what this is about. Before diving into the text itself, I'd like to offer a quotation from Dogen's writing in Shobo Genzo Koan, The Problem of Everyday Life. And I'll use Reverend Master Jiyu-Kennett's translation from Zen is Eternal Life. It says, when one studies Buddhism, one studies oneself. When one studies oneself, one forgets oneself. When one forgets oneself, one is enlightened by everything. And this very enlightenment breaks the bonds of clinging to both body and mind, not only for oneself, but for all beings as well. And that's, as I said, translation of Reverend Master Jiyu-Kennett. I'm going to try to say a little bit about the use of the word self as I give this talk, because what is the self anyway? Great Master Dogen and Uchiyama Roshi use the Japanese word jiko for self, meaning one's whole identity. So what exactly are we talking about here? Isn't the Buddha's teaching that there is no separate individual self? So this is a question. What is this self that we're talking about? What is meant by this? I'm going to offer a quote from one of the footnotes in this book to the 3rd section. in Uchiyama Roshi's commentary, the footnote says, and if you're finding it hard to understand what this self business is, this might help you understand that it is hard to understand. The footnote says it should be clear to readers by now that trying to translate the Buddhist term jiko, or self, is no easy matter. There is no exact equivalent in English. Furthermore, even in ordinary Japanese, the term jiko doesn't have all the connotations that Dogen gives it. The word self in English has its own baggage to carry, which is for the most part psychological and refers to an individual. Dogen's term for this jiko, that is all-inclusive, is, pardon my Japanese, jinisai jiko, or exhaustive, all-inclusive jiko. So when we're talking about self, we can be talking about the whole self, which is universal, or we can talk about the collection of opinions and feelings and thoughts and body parts that we all have, which we sometimes think of as myself. So we need to reflect on what kind of self are we talking about. Back to the quote from the Genjo Koan about when we study the self, we forget the self. When we forget the being that we usually call myself, that is when we are enlightened by everything, together with all beings. And I'll return to this point as we go along. Another Japanese term I want to mention is the dainin of the chapter title, which is Hachi Dainin Gaku. This can be translated as true adult, or great being, or bodhisattva. So we can now speak of the exhaustive, all-inclusive self as a great being, or bodhisattva. And I find this particular chapter of Dogen very helpful in that it sets forth ways for us to carry out our aspiration to be bodhisattvas, and it helps us to do that. Now, back to the 8 qualities of a great person. As I mentioned, section 3 is translated by Uchiyama Roshi as appreciating serenity/quietude, while Reverend Master Hubert's translation is enjoying the tranquility of nirvana. While I hesitate to speak of nirvana, that which is realized at the time of enlightenment, I can certainly speak with a degree of first-hand knowledge about the appreciation of serenity and quietude, which I believe is familiar to all of us. Let's look at some possible sources of serenity and quietude. As I write this talk, I have the good fortune to be enjoying the serenity and quietude of retreat time in our hermitage. This means very few phone calls, no emails, nobody snagging me for business while I'm in the line to get my food for dinner. I have more time than usual to meditate, study, rest, and reflect. This helps me to find a certain peace of mind, which on one level feels somehow deeper than my ordinary mental state. However, there's a fire in the nearby mountain wilderness, bringing heavy helicopter traffic, sometimes sounding as if it will crash right into the temple. Although this doesn't happen to bother me, I suspect that there are those who would find little peace in this circumstance. In other words, we can't depend on setting up the perfect circumstances in order to find a peaceful heart, and we can find it in the midst of ordinary daily life. Now, the Buddha said in this chapter, if you wish to enjoy true tranquility, unaffected by the conditions around you, then clearly it is critical to live in a quiet place, apart from all the noise and clamor that surrounds you, internally and externally. And this sentence raised a question for me, which is, unaffected by the conditions around you. So if one is unaffected by the surrounding conditions, what does it matter in what circumstances we find ourselves? Why is it critical to go to live in a quiet place? So now immediately I thought, so Margaret, who are you to question the Buddha? So I had to sit with this question. And the answer that came up is kind of beyond the notion of the opposites between quiet and noisy, for example, peaceful and troubled. My retreat certainly demonstrated the spiritual value of sitting in a quiet place, away from noise and clamor. However, if I'm meditating in all circumstances, what difference does it make if I'm surrounded by noise and clamor? I find few things noisier and more clamorous than kitchen cleanup during an introductory retreat, when the kitchen is jam-packed with eager newcomers who have never been here before and want to help but haven't a clue about what is to be done. How can I, and I'm still working on this, find tranquility in this circumstance? One thing that has recently occurred to me, and that was on retreat, and I haven't had a chance to try it out yet, is rather than focusing on the clattering of bowls and utensils or the roar of the dishwasher, to turn my attention to the willingness of those newcomers to help and to practice with us. I can be grateful for their willingness to be with us and help us clean the kitchen, rather than being irritated by the crowded spaces and loud sounds. As I said, I haven't had a chance to try this yet, but there is an introductory retreat coming up, and I can let you know how it works out. So where do we find the peace that comes from serenity and quietude? The answer, as I'm sure you'll all suspect, is in our own hearts, in our practice of meditation and preceptual living. The mind of meditation is a mind at peace, and we can carry that mind with us wherever we go. And as Dogen writes, quoting the Buddha, if you wish to enjoy true tranquility, unaffected by the conditions around you, then clearly it is critical to live in a quiet place, apart from all the noise and clamor that surrounds you internally and externally. So we can carry that quiet place with us into whatever circumstances we go. And at the same time, it is essential sometimes to put aside all personal affairs, find a quiet place, and ponder how to relieve the sources of suffering. That's in the words of the chapter. Now wait a minute, who is able to do this? Not the parents of young children, not persons of limited means who have to work for a living amidst the workplaces of cities and suburbs. Remember, the Buddha gave this teaching to monks. Does that mean that one has to be a monk or perhaps a well-to-do single person in order to have a peaceful heart? I don't think so. I find much truth in what the Buddha and Great Master Dogen say here. And I don't believe that peace of mind and heart is limited to only a few fortunate individuals. So what are we to make of this? As I'm attempting to explain what can't really be explained, sitting in a quiet place is not somehow separate from living out our daily lives. And at the same time, it is vital to take time to retreat. For me, the point is not to let, and I'm sorry I scribbled this morning before the ceremony, some of this. For me, the point is not to get stuck in the opposites such as quiet and noisy. As I just mentioned, we all have the resource of meditation. When we sit or work or play in the mind of meditation, we can find true peace of heart. For those of you who live near a temple, you can take refuge there at any convenient time. The doors of the abbey and the priories are open much of the time to interested practitioners as well as newcomers. Why not take advantage of this if you can? And I don't mean to sound like an advertisement for the temple, but you can take advantage of this. And there are many places in nature, for example, such as the seaside, or a grove of tall trees, or a garden, which are excellent places of retreat. Retreat doesn't have to be for a week or a month. It can be for 5 minutes during your day. So this is a bit of a digression. Let's get back to the chapter. What Dogen refers to as the whole self can offer us a peaceful refuge. How is this so? Recall the quote, "To study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." Reverend Master Jiyu often referred to what she called the selfish self. That is, the egocentric collection of our thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions, desires, memories, opinions, all that we perceive as being at the center of the universe. Reverend Master would encourage us to live from the true self, by which I believe she meant what Dogen called the all-inclusive whole self. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about two separate individual, quote, selves here. Rather, I just prefer to suggest that we train ourselves to take our spiritual direction from that whole or true self that includes all and rejects nothing. Dogen includes in his chapter the following passage taken from the scripture of the Buddha's last teachings. If you take pleasure in being in a group, you will surely encounter the disharmony and suffering of the group. It is like a gathering of birds that nest in a large tree. Eventually, the tree will wither, and the limbs will come crashing down from the stress. Now, this brought to my mind immediately a very strong image of the schoolyard when I was in the 7th grade. We had graduated from elementary school and gone on to junior high school. We were teenagers now, 13, brand new teenagers. So we were too old and sophisticated to play games on the playground anymore. No more marbles, jacks, jump rope, or so on. Instead, everybody stood in a giant clot of humanity, with the two most popular girls in the school, Margie and Julie, at the center, and spreading outwards from there, packed together, all crammed, packed together. There's just giant clot of humanity. I was on the far outside. But that image came to mind when I read that passage. So what do we think is being said here? My take on this teaching is that it is not absolute. After all, I live in a monastic community with a group. The passage explicitly mentions taking pleasure in being in a group. I remember a long time ago a friend of mine once saying that they hated to be alone and they sought to be with others as often as possible, avoiding solitude as much as they could. I wonder if this is part of what the passage is talking about. Finding pleasure only in being with a group and displeasure at being alone. The image of a tree falling apart and crashing to the ground under the weight of countless birds is a vivid one, isn't it? The way I see this is as a warning about being habitually dependent on the company of others. Solitude gives us the rich opportunity to face ourselves, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to learn to accept what we see and resolve to work on what we need to change. Uchiyama Roshi quotes the Buddha as saying, "To depend on others means to always be unsettled." Great Master Tozan, one of the great ancestors of our tradition, said, "Truly I must not seek for the truth from others, for then it will be far from me." Studying ourselves includes, for me, asking, who's in charge here? I recently heard the term influencers used, it seemed, to refer to a category of people, such as doctors, lawyers, accountants, garbage men, or whatever. Garbage collectors, rather, sorry. Curiosity moved me to look it up online, and if I understand it correctly, and I may not, it's about people who use social media for marketing purposes to promote products, services, or views. I don't use social media. However, I find it helpful to stop and reflect for a moment on how much of what I think of as myself comes from the influence of others. For example, I still hold basically the same socio-political views as those my parents raised me with. And I tend to agree with people who hold those same views and disagree, sometimes very strongly, with those of differing views. To study myself implies making an effort to step out of my identification of something permanent, individual, with those views. The same way I might step out of my work clothes when the work is finished, and thereby make way for my true self to come out from behind the clouds. Returning to the chapter, Uchiyama Roshi talks about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and I'm going to leave that aside because I think it's outside the scope of what I'm trying to get at. But he does say this: because we look at all our suffering and anxiety from the perspective of our relationship to the, quote, other, it is vital for us to see everything from the foundation of the reality of Jiko. That's our whole self, our whole all-inclusive self. Now, even though I use the term the reality of Jiko, this is not a particularly different thing to do, for everyone is living out our whole all-inclusive self. It doesn't matter whichever way we might stumble or fall, we're still living out Jiko. I find that very comforting. East or west, north or south, everyone is always living out Jiko. The problem that arises is this: because even though it is as I've just explained, still it is possible to lose sight of Jiko, what with all the blood flowing into our heads. And we start to look at everything based on ordinary social values, comparing ourselves with others. And I like that image of all the blood flowing into our heads. If you go on the internet for a few minutes, you can probably notice all the blood flowing into your head, all the stuff. Again, in the words of Great Master Tozan, truly I must not seek for the truth from others. And as Uchiyama Roshi put it, if you're sitting true meditation, then anyone can become who they truly are. This is a meditation whereby you discover your own worth within yourself by yourself. And that doesn't mean it isn't good to have a teacher or to study with others. If you think of the well-worn analogy of snowflakes, then each of us is our own individual snowflake, and together with all the other individual snowflakes, we make up snow. We each express snow in slightly different and yet somehow identical ways. And it helps if we don't get hung up on, am I a snowflake or am I snow? One of the things that drew me to my master was seeing in her a person living out their own life just as they were. So I'm going to finally conclude by directly stating an essential point of all this, and I'll turn again to the words of Uchiyama Roshi. He says, in short, what is most critical here is that our whole self is inclusive of all sentient beings. And that harkens back to that first quote from Genjo Koan, that when we forget the self, we are enlightened together with all beings. If that were not the case, living in a serene, quiet place would be nothing more than an existence of waiting for death. Sitting in meditation and living out our lives as whole self, inclusive of all sentient beings, is what is most important in Buddhism, says Uchiyama Roshi. This is the basic principle or standard of living in a serene, quiet place. And that's it for today. I hope it's been helpful, and I thank you all very much for coming. And now we can go out and enjoy this beautiful day. Thank you.